In the quiet town of Brook Hollow, where the streets were lined with old oaks and the pace of life moved like honey dripping from a spoon, most people knew each other by name, or at least by reputation. There was the baker who always gave extra rolls to kids who helped sweep his porch, the retired librarian who still corrected grammar in grocery store flyers, and the high school music teacher who conducted the annual spring showcase with the seriousness of a general preparing for war. But lately there was someone new in town, someone no one could quite figure out. Her name was Elira Voss, and she had moved into the small apartment above Marlowe's bakery just before the first frost of autumn. She carried only 2 suitcases and a narrow wooden box wrapped in faded velvet, which she handled like it held something sacred. The neighbors noticed her right away, not because she made noise, but because she made none at all. She never waved from her window, never lingered at the mailbox, never joined the weekend farmer's market. She walked with her head slightly down, shoulders drawn in, as if trying to take up less space in the world. At Brook Hollow High, where she worked as an administrative assistant, she was just as quiet. She arrived precisely at 7:45 a.m., made tea in the staff lounge without speaking to anyone, and spent her days organizing student records, filing permission slips, and occasionally helping teachers with photocopies. She wore simple blouses in muted colors, olive, slate gray, soft brown, and kept her dark hair pulled back in a low bun. No jewelry, no perfume, no idle chatter. Some assumed she was shy. Others thought she was aloof. A few even whispered that she must be hiding something. What no one knew was that every night, after the last bakery customer had left and the streetlights flickered on, Elira would unlock the narrow, velvet-wrapped box. Inside was not jewelry or old letters, but sheet music, yellowed pages filled with dense notations, smudged pencil marks, and the faint scent of rosin. And beside it, propped against the wall of her tiny living room, stood a second-hand upright piano she'd bought from a retiring music teacher for $200 and a promise to keep it loved. When her fingers touched the keys, everything changed. The woman who spoke in whispers during the day became someone else entirely in the dark. Her hands, usually folded neatly in her lap or busy with paperwork, moved with a kind of quiet authority over the ivory and ebony. She didn't play pop songs or familiar classics. Instead, she played pieces no one in Brook Hollow had ever heard. Complex, layered compositions that seemed to hold entire storms and sunrises within them. Sometimes she played for an hour, sometimes until dawn, and though the walls were thin, the notes never disturbed the neighbors. They drifted out like secrets meant only for the night air, but secrets have a way of slipping through cracks. One evening, old Mr. Darnell, the school custodian, was fixing a leak in the apartment building's basement when he heard it. A cascade of notes so rich and precise it made him pause with his wrench in midair. He stood there listening until his knees ached. He didn't know much about music, but he knew beauty when he heard it. He never mentioned it to anyone. Not yet. Life at Brook Hollow High continued as usual, until it didn't. The annual spring showcase was the school's biggest event of the year. Students performed monologues, dance routines, poetry readings, and, most importantly, musical pieces. It was a tradition that stretched back decades, and the music department took it very seriously. This year they'd planned something special, a performance of Sergei Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, one of the most demanding and emotionally intense piano pieces ever written. It was to be played by Lila Chen, the school's star pianist, a senior with perfect pitch competition medals, and a future scholarship to Juilliard. But 3 weeks before the showcase, Lila came down with a severe case of mononucleosis. She was bedridden, exhausted, and heartbroken. "I can't even lift my arms," she told Mr. Halverson, the head of the music department, over a tearful phone call. "I'm so sorry." Mr. Halverson paced his office like a caged animal. The program was already printed. Tickets had been sold. The local paper was running a feature next week. Canceling the Rachmaninoff piece would be a disaster. It was the centerpiece of the evening. He called every piano teacher in the county. All were booked. He asked former students. None were available on short notice. Desperation crept into his voice as he slumped into his chair, staring at the ceiling. That's when Ms. Gable, the drama teacher, poked her head in. "You know," she said casually, "Elira mentioned once that she used to play piano." Mr. Halverson blinked. "Elira? From the front office?" "Yeah, I heard her say it during a staff lunch last fall." Something like, "Oh, I dabbled a bit when I was younger." Ms. Gable shrugged. Probably nothing serious, but maybe she could give it a try, just to fill the slot. Mr. Halverson wasn't convinced. Elira, the quiet woman who barely said good morning? But as the hours ticked by and no other options appeared, the idea began to take root. After all, it wasn't like they needed a virtuoso. They just needed someone to get through the piece without crashing and burning. And if Elira had dabbled, maybe she knew enough to stumble through it. The next morning, Mr. Halverson approached Elira in the hallway. She was carrying a stack of enrollment forms, her eyes on the floor. "Elira," he said, forcing a friendly tone. "Got a minute?" She nodded, setting the papers down carefully on a nearby bench. "We're in a bit of a bind with the spring showcase," he explained. "Lila's sick, and we're short a pianist for the Rachmaninoff prelude." "I heard you used to play." Elira's hands stilled. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in her eyes. Panic. Regret, but it vanished so quickly he thought he'd imagined it. "I played a little," she said softly. "A long time ago." "Well," he said, clapping his hands together with forced cheer. "Would you consider stepping in? Just this once? We'd be so grateful." She looked down at her shoes. The silence stretched. Mr. Halverson started to worry she'd say no, but then she gave the tiniest nod. "I'll try," she whispered. He beamed. "That's wonderful. Rehearsals start Monday after school in the auditorium. Don't worry. We'll help you every step of the way." He walked away, already mentally revising the program. Elira stood still for a long moment, then picked up her papers and returned to her desk. Her hands trembled slightly as she sorted the forms, but no one noticed. That night she didn't play the piano. She sat by the window watching the moon rise over the bakery's chimney and wondered if she'd just made a terrible mistake. Monday came. The auditorium was empty except for Mr. Halverson and two other music teachers, all seated in the front row with clipboards. The school's old upright piano sat center stage, its finish scratched, one pedal squeaking. Elira walked in wearing the same gray blouse she'd worn to work that day. She didn't look at the audience. She just sat, placed her hands on the keys and began. And she played. Badly, not disastrously, but clearly out of practice. She missed notes, hesitated at transitions, and played the opening chords so slowly they lost their power. Mr. Halverson exchanged glances with the others. One teacher scribbled notes. Another stifled a sigh. "Take it from measure 12, Mr. Halverson said gently, "and try to keep the tempo steady this time." Elira nodded and tried again. Still clumsy, still hesitant, but she didn't complain. She didn't make excuses. She just kept going, her expression unreadable. After an hour, they let her go. "You're doing fine," Mr. Halverson lied. "Just keep practicing." She thanked them quietly and left. But as soon as she was home, she sat at her own piano and played the entire Rachmaninoff prelude, flawlessly, from memory. Her fingers flew, her body swayed slightly with the music, and the room filled with thunder and tenderness in equal measure. When she finished, she rested her forehead on the cool wood of the piano and closed her eyes. She wasn't playing poorly because she couldn't do better. She was playing poorly because she was afraid. Afraid of being seen, afraid of being remembered. Afraid that if she played like she truly could, the past would come rushing back and she wasn't sure she could survive it again. Still, she kept showing up to rehearsals. Each day she played just well enough to avoid being replaced, but never well enough to raise suspicion. The teachers assumed she was struggling but determined. They praised her effort, offered simplified fingerings, and patted her on the back like she was a brave underdog. What they didn't know was that every night after her practice at school, she returned home and played not just Rachmaninoff but Chopin, Debussy, Scriabin, pieces that demanded not just skill but soul. And in those private hours, she wasn't Elira, the office assistant. She was someone else entirely, a woman who had once stood on the world's greatest stages, whose name had once been whispered in awe in concert halls from Vienna to Tokyo. But that woman had vanished years ago, buried under grief and guilt. And Elira wasn't sure she deserved to bring her back. As the showcase drew closer, the school buzzed with anticipation. Posters went up. Students rehearsed in every spare corner. And Elira, still quiet, still unassuming, became the subject of mild curiosity. "Did you hear she's playing the Rachmaninoff piece?" someone would say. "Yeah, but I heard she's never played in public before." Poor thing. She's gonna be nervous. No one imagined the truth. Not even Mr. Darnell, who now made a point to linger near the auditorium during her rehearsals just to listen. He noticed something the others didn't. The way her fingers sometimes lingered on a chord a beat too long, as if savoring it. The way her breathing changed when she hit a difficult passage, not from strain but from focus. Once, when she thought the room was empty, she played a short improvisation so beautiful it brought tears to his eyes. He never told a soul, but he started leaving a single white gardenia on the piano bench before each rehearsal. A silent thank you. Elira found the first flower and stared at it for a long time. She didn't know who left it, but she understood the message. Someone had heard her. Not the version she showed at school, but the real her. And that terrified her more than anything, because if one person had heard the truth, others might too. And once the truth was out, there would be no going back to the quiet life she'd built, the life that kept her safe. But the showcase was only 5 days away. The tickets were sold. The spotlight was waiting. And Elira Voss, the modest woman from the front office, was about to step into it, whether she was ready or not. Rehearsals grew longer as the spring showcase inched closer. Every afternoon, right after the final bell, Elira would slip into the auditorium like a shadow, her worn tote bag slung over one shoulder, her expression calm but distant. The music teachers, Mr. Halverson and his 2 colleagues, sat in the front row with their clipboards, thermoses of coffee, and a growing mix of pity and mild frustration. They still believed she was doing her best, and they admired her quiet determination, even if her playing remained rough around the edges. To them, she was a well-meaning amateur stepping far outside her comfort zone. They didn't suspect that every stumble, every missed note, every hesitant pause was carefully placed, like stones laid to build a wall between who she was and who she used to be. She played the Rachmaninoff prelude slowly, her fingers pressing the keys with deliberate caution. She exaggerated her mistakes just enough to seem genuine. A wrong chord here, a rushed phrase there, a moment where she pretended to lose her place in the sheet music. Each time Mr. Halverson would lean forward and say, "Let's take it from the top of page 2, or try keeping your wrist a little looser," and she would nod. Adjust and try again, still imperfect. Still safe, but safety came at a cost. Every fake mistake felt like a betrayal, not of the teachers, but of the music itself. Rachmaninoff's prelude wasn't just notes on a page. It was grief turned into sound, longing carved into rhythm. To play it half-heartedly, to flatten its power for the sake of hiding, felt like whispering a scream. Still, she kept up the act. Because the alternative, revealing herself, meant opening a door she'd spent years nailing shut. At home, though, the truth poured out. Late into the night, when the town slept and the bakery downstairs was dark, Elira would sit at her piano and play not just the assigned piece, but entire concertos from memory. Her fingers remembered what her mind tried to forget. She played with eyes closed, shoulders relaxed, body swaying slightly as if carried by an invisible current. The music filled the small apartment, spilling out the window and into the quiet street below. Sometimes she'd stop mid-phrase, overwhelmed by a memory. A concert hall in Prague. The scent of her sister's perfume backstage. The weight of applause that once felt like love but now felt like loss. She never cried. Not out loud. But sometimes after playing, she'd sit in silence for so long the streetlights outside would flicker off one by one, leaving her in darkness. Meanwhile, word about Elira's involvement in the showcase had spread through the school. Most students found it amusing. "The office lady's gonna play Rachmaninoff?" One boy snickered in the hallway. "That's like asking the lunch lady to perform brain surgery." Others were kinder. A few even stopped by the auditorium during breaks just to peek in, curious to see the quiet woman they barely noticed now taking center stage, even if only for rehearsal. One of those curious onlookers was a freshman named Tavi. He wasn't in the music program. He didn't play an instrument, but he loved sound. The way rain tapped on windows, how wind moved through trees, even the hum of the old radiator in his bedroom. He'd lost his mother the year before, and since then silence had felt too heavy. Music, even bad music, gave him something to lean on. He started sitting in the back row during Elira's rehearsals, unnoticed by the teachers. At first he expected to hear something awkward and clumsy, and for the first few days that's what he got, or so it seemed. But then, one afternoon, something shifted. Elira was playing the climactic section of the prelude, the part where the music swells into a storm of chords and emotion. She played it slowly at first, fumbling slightly, just as she always did. But then, almost without realizing it, her tempo quickened. Her fingers found their old certainty. For 3 full measures, she played with raw, unguarded power, the kind that didn't come from practice, but from somewhere deeper. Tavi froze. His breath caught. He'd never heard anything like it. Not in school, not on the radio, not even in the classical recordings his mother used to play. It wasn't just skill, it was feeling. Like someone had opened a window into a room full of ghosts and let them sing. When she stopped abruptly, as if startled by her own honesty, and mumbled, "Sorry, I lost it again." Tavi didn't believe her. He watched her carefully after that. Noticed how her hands never shook when she turned the pages. Noticed how she never actually looked at the sheet music during the easier parts. Noticed how, when she thought no one was watching, her foot would tap in perfect time with rhythms far more complex than the piece required. He didn't say anything, but he started coming earlier, sitting closer, and one day he left a folded piece of notebook paper on the piano bench before she arrived. On it he'd written in careful handwriting, "You don't have to hide. I heard you." Elira found the note during a break. She read it once, then again. Her hands trembled. She looked around the empty auditorium, heart pounding. Who had written this? How much had they really heard? She tucked the note into her bag and didn't mention it to anyone. But that night, for the first time in weeks, she didn't play a single note. She sat by the window instead, staring at the stars, wondering if anonymity was a gift or a cage. Back at school, tensions were rising. The showcase was now just 4 days away, and Mr. Halverson was growing anxious. The program order had been finalized. The lighting cues were set, but Elira's progress felt stalled. "She's trying," he told the other teachers, "but I'm not sure she'll be ready." One afternoon, frustrated by a particularly rough run-through, he snapped, "Elira, you've got to commit. This isn't just background music, it's the emotional heart of the whole evening. If you're not going to take it seriously, maybe we should find someone else." The words hung in the air like smoke. Elira didn't flinch. She just looked down at her hands and said quietly, "I'm doing my best," but inside something cracked. That evening, instead of going straight home, she walked to the far end of town, past the old train tracks and the overgrown park until she reached the riverbank. She sat on a weathered bench and watched the water ripple under the moonlight. For the first time, she asked herself the question she'd been avoiding. Why am I still hiding? She hadn't chosen this town to disappear forever. She'd chosen it to heal. But healing wasn't the same as hiding, and maybe, just maybe, playing the truth wasn't a betrayal of her past, but a way to honor it. The next day, during rehearsal, something changed. She still played with restraint, still held back her full ability, but this time there was a new steadiness in her posture, a quiet resolve in her eyes. When Mr. Halverson corrected her, she listened without shrinking. When she made a mistake, she didn't apologize, she simply tried again. And then, halfway through the session, the unthinkable happened. The school's upright piano, old, temperamental, and long overdue for tuning, let out a jarring, sour note in the middle of a delicate passage. Elira stopped. Mr. Halverson groaned. One of the other teachers muttered, "Not again." They tried to fix it, but the key was sticking. The tuner wouldn't be back for 2 days. Panic set in. "We can't rehearse without a working piano," Mr. Halverson said, running a hand through his thinning hair. Elira looked around the stage, then toward the storage room at the back of the auditorium. "What about the grand piano?" she asked softly. Everyone turned to her. "The one in the back?" Mr. Halverson frowned. "That old Steinway? It hasn't been touched in 20 years. The strings are probably rusted. The action's shot. It might still work," she said. "Just let me try." Reluctantly, they agreed. 2 custodians helped roll the massive instrument onto the stage. Dust flew as they uncovered it. The wood was dull, the pedals stiff, but the frame was solid. Elira sat down, adjusted the bench, and placed her hands on the keys. She didn't play the Rachmaninoff piece. Not yet. Instead, she played a few simple scales to test the touch. Then, almost absent-mindedly, she began an improvisation. Soft at first, then building into something rich and intricate, full of cascading arpeggios and unexpected harmonies. It wasn't flashy. It was intimate. Like a conversation between old friends. The room fell utterly silent. Mr. Halverson's coffee cup hovered halfway to his lips. One teacher dropped her pen. Tavi, sitting in the back as usual, leaned forward so far he was nearly off his seat. And Elira, she wasn't pretending anymore, she played for maybe 2 minutes. Then she stopped as if remembering where she was and cleared her throat. It works, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. No one spoke for a long moment. Then Mr. Halverson stood up slowly. Elira, he said, his voice unsteady. Who are you? She didn't answer. She just looked at her hands, then at the piano. Then out at the empty rows of seats as if seeing them for the first time not as a place to hide, but as a place to be seen. Later that night, a short video began circulating among students. Someone, likely Tavi, had recorded the last 30 seconds of her improvisation on a phone. The caption read, "Office lady just destroyed on piano. No one's talking about this?" Within hours, it had hundreds of views. Comments poured in. Is this real? She's been working in the front office this whole time? Why is she hiding her talent? Elira didn't know about the video, but she could feel the shift in the air the next day. Whispers followed her down the hall. Students stared when she passed. Even the principal gave her a strange, thoughtful look during morning announcements. She considered quitting. Packing her bags. Leaving Brook Hollow before the showcase, before the truth fully surfaced. But then she remembered the note. You don't have to hide. And she remembered the piano, the way it had felt to play without pretending, even for just a moment. So she stayed. She returned to rehearsal the next day, not as the timid office assistant, but as someone standing on the edge of a decision. The teachers treated her differently now, less condescending, more curious. They didn't ask questions. They just watched and listened. That night she played again. Not for the showcase, not for anyone else. Just for herself. And for the first time in years, the music didn't feel like a ghost. It felt like a homecoming. The spring showcase was now just 2 days away. The town was buzzing. Tickets were sold out. And no one, not the teachers, not the students, not even Elira herself, knew what would happen when she sat down at that grand piano in front of a full auditorium. But one thing was certain. The woman who walked onto that stage would not be the same one who had walked in 3 weeks ago. Whether she played brilliantly or broke down in tears, she would no longer be hiding. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The morning after the grand piano was uncovered, the air in Brook Hollow High felt different, charged, like the moment before a summer storm breaks. Students whispered in hallways, teachers exchanged glances in the staff lounge, and even the usual lunchtime chaos in the cafeteria seemed quieter, as if everyone was holding their breath. The short video of Elira's impromptu performance had spread far beyond the school. Parents had seen it. Local shop owners had shared it in community groups. Someone had even sent it to the town's weekly paper. Elira noticed the change right away. When she walked into the front office, the usual morning chatter stopped. The secretary, who normally greeted her with a distracted morning, now looked up with wide eyes and a hesitant smile. A group of seniors passing by in the hallway actually stepped aside to let her through, as if she were someone important. She kept her head down, but her stomach twisted. She wasn't used to being seen, really seen, and it made her feel exposed, like standing in a room with all the lights suddenly turned on. She considered calling in sick, staying home, pretending the whole thing had never happened. But deep down she knew running wouldn't fix anything. The secret was out. Not fully, not officially, but enough. And the showcase was only 2 days away. Rehearsal that afternoon was tense. Mr. Halverson didn't say much when she arrived. He just nodded toward the grand piano, now positioned center stage with fresh polish on its lid and a small bouquet of wildflowers resting on top, left anonymously, but Elira suspected Tavi again. She sat down, adjusted the bench and placed her hands on the keys. For a moment she hesitated. Then she began to play. This time she didn't hold back, not completely, but enough to show she wasn't the clumsy amateur they'd assumed. Her fingers moved with quiet confidence. The notes rang clear and strong. She still played the Rachmaninoff prelude slower than it was meant to be, still softened some of the more dramatic passages, but there was no mistaking it now. This woman knew the piano. Really knew it. Mr. Halverson watched, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he cleared his throat. That was much better, he said carefully. You've been holding out on us, haven't you? Elira didn't look up. I just needed the right instrument, she said softly. He studied her for a long moment, then sighed. Look, Elira, I don't know your story and I won't pry. But if you've got this kind of talent, why hide it? Why work in an office filing papers? She didn't answer. She couldn't. How could she explain that music had once been everything to her, and then in an instant it became a reminder of everything she'd lost, that every note she played used to carry her sister's laughter, her mother's pride, her own dreams. And now, for years, it had only carried silence. Instead, she simply said, some things are easier to leave behind. He didn't press further. But from that point on, the rehearsals changed. The teachers stopped treating her like a project and started treating her like a peer. They asked her opinion on phrasing, dynamics, even the lighting cues for her performance. They stopped correcting her and started listening. Still, the pressure mounted. The showcase was no longer just a school event. It had become the talk of the town. People who hadn't set foot in the auditorium in decades were buying tickets. Rumors swirled. She used to be famous. She walked away from a concert career. She's playing under a fake name. No one knew the truth, but everyone sensed it was something big. That evening, as Elira walked home past the bakery, now closed, its windows dark, she found a small envelope taped to her door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with no name, just a few lines in neat handwriting. I lost my mom last year. Music's the only thing that makes the quiet feel less heavy. If you play tomorrow like you did the other day, maybe it'll help someone else too. Not just you. She recognized Tavi's words instantly. Her throat tightened. She hadn't thought about how her music might affect others. She'd only ever thought about how it affected her, how it opened old wounds, how it pulled her back into memories she'd tried to bury. But what if it could do more than that? What if it could be a bridge instead of a ghost? That night she didn't practice the Rachmaninoff piece. Instead, she sat at her piano and played something new, something she'd started composing years ago but never finished. It began softly like footsteps in snow, then built into a melody full of longing and light. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was creating, not just remembering. The next day, just one day before the showcase, disaster struck. During the final full dress rehearsal, with the stage crew testing lights and the drama students running lines in the wings, Elira sat at the grand piano and began her piece. She played with more feeling than ever before, letting the music swell and breathe. The teachers watched in awe. Even the usually restless stagehands stood still. Then halfway through the most intense passage, the piano let out a sharp, metallic ping. A string snapped. The sound cut through the music like a knife. Elira's hands froze. Everyone in the room gasped. Mr. Halverson rushed to the piano. It's the bass string, he muttered, peering inside. We can't replace it tonight. The tuner's out of town. Panic rippled through the group. Without that string, the piano's lower register was dead. The Rachmaninoff prelude relied heavily on those deep, resonant chords. Without them, the piece would sound hollow, like a heartbeat missing every third beat. We're ruined, one teacher whispered. Mr. Halverson turned to Elira, his face pale. I'm so sorry. We'll have to. I don't know. Maybe we can find a recording? Or, no, Elira said quietly. They all looked at her. She stood up, walked to the edge of the stage, and looked out at the empty seats. Then she turned back. I'll play it anyway. But the missing string, someone started. It's just one note, she said. I can work around it, or I can play something else, Mr. Halverson frowned. Something else? The program's printed. The audience is expecting Rachmaninoff. I know, she said. But maybe they need something different. Silence fell. No one knew what to say. This wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't safe. But then Tavi, who had been helping with set design in the back, spoke up. Let her choose, he said, his voice steady despite his youth. If she's willing to play after all this, she should play what matters to her. Everyone turned to look at him, surprised. He shrugged, suddenly shy again. Just seems right. Mr. Halverson hesitated. Then he nodded slowly. All right, Elira. It's your call. She took a deep breath. I'll play my own piece. It's called For Leora. No one asked who Leora was. They could hear the love and loss in the name. That evening, the school made an announcement. Due to unforeseen circumstances, Elira Voss would be performing an original composition instead of the scheduled Rachmaninoff prelude. Some parents grumbled. Others were intrigued, but tickets were non-refundable and curiosity won out. At home, Elira prepared. She didn't practice for perfection. She practiced for truth. She played For Leora over and over, not to memorize it, but to live inside it. She thought of her sister. The way she laughed too loud, danced in the kitchen, insisted on playing violin duets even when Elira was tired. She thought of the night of the accident, the phone call, the silence that followed. And she thought of the years after, when she stopped playing because it hurt too much to hear beauty in a world that felt broken. But now she realized, beauty wasn't the enemy. Silence was. The night before the showcase, she didn't sleep. She sat by her window watching the stars and made a promise to herself. No more hiding. Not out of fear. Not out of guilt. If she was going to play, she would play like she meant it. Like her sister was listening. Like her music mattered, like she still belonged in the world. The next morning, the school buzzed with final preparations. Costumes were steamed, scripts were double-checked, and the auditorium was swept clean. Elira arrived early. Not in her usual gray blouse, but in a simple black dress, elegant but unassuming. She carried no sheet music. She didn't need it. As she walked through the hall, students stepped aside, not out of pity or curiosity anymore, but respect. Someone had printed a small sign and taped it to the backstage door. Elira Voss, piano. She touched it lightly, then went inside. Backstage, she found a single white gardenia resting on the piano bench. The same flower Mr. Darnell had been leaving. She smiled faintly. She wasn't alone. Out front, the auditorium filled quickly. Parents, teachers, townspeople, even the mayor found their seats. Whispers floated through the air. Is it true? She used to be famous. I heard she walked away from Carnegie Hall. None of it was accurate, but none of it was entirely wrong either. When the lights dimmed and the MC announced her name, a hush fell over the crowd. Elira walked on stage slowly, her footsteps quiet on the wooden floor. She didn't bow. She didn't smile. She simply sat, placed her hands on the keys, and closed her eyes. Then she began to play. Not Rachmaninoff, not a showpiece, but For Leora, a piece born from grief, shaped by memory and offered as a gift. The music started soft, like a breath. Then it grew, swelling with sorrow, dancing with joy, trembling with love. It wasn't perfect. There were moments where her hands shook, where a note wavered, but that only made it more human, more real. In the front row, Mr. Halverson wiped his eyes. In the back, Tavi sat perfectly still, tears streaming down his face. And somewhere in the middle, an older woman clutched her husband's hand and whispered, "It sounds like my daughter used to play." When the final chord faded into silence, no one moved, no one clapped. They just sat, holding the music in their hearts. Then, slowly, one person stood. Then another. And soon the entire auditorium was on its feet. Not cheering, not shouting, but applauding with a kind of quiet reverence, as if they'd just witnessed something sacred. Elira opened her eyes. She looked out at the sea of faces, not with fear, but with gratitude. She hadn't fixed the past. She hadn't brought her sister back. But for the first time in years, she hadn't run from the music, and that, she realized, was enough. The morning after the showcase, Brook Hollow woke up different. Not in any dramatic way, no parades, no headlines, no sudden fame, but in the quiet, lasting kind of way that real change happens. The air felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted not just from Elira, but from the whole town. People walked a little slower, listened a little more, smiled at strangers with something warmer than politeness. At the school, students didn't just pass Elira in the hallway. They stopped. Not to gawk or ask for autographs, but to say thank you. "Your music helped me sleep last night," one girl whispered. "I kept thinking about my brother," said another. Even teachers, usually brisk and task-focused, lingered near the front office just to hear her voice. Softer now, less guarded. But Elira wasn't basking in it. She wasn't planning a comeback tour or updating her resume for concert halls. She was doing something far more ordinary and far more brave. She was staying. Because the truth was, the performance hadn't healed everything. It had opened a door, yes, but walking through it meant facing what lay on the other side. And what lay there was memory. That afternoon she sat alone in her apartment, the grand piano still echoing in her bones. She hadn't touched her own upright since the showcase. She didn't need to. The music was already inside her, humming under her skin like a second heartbeat. But with it came the past, sharp, vivid, and tender. She remembered Leora, her younger sister, with startling clarity. Not just the accident, the screech of tires, the phone call in the middle of the night, the hospital waiting room that smelled like antiseptic and dread, but the life before it. Leora, barefoot on the kitchen tiles, playing Vivaldi on her violin while Elira accompanied on piano. Leora, grinning after a botched performance, saying, "Who cares if we messed up? We made something beautiful anyway." Leora hugging her before getting into the car that rainy evening, saying, "Don't wait up. I'll be back before you finish your etude." She never came back. After that, Elira couldn't play. Not really. She'd sit at the piano, hands hovering over the keys, but the notes felt like stones in her throat. Every melody reminded her of Leora's laugh, her passion, her belief that music could stitch broken things back together. And when Elira realized she couldn't do that, couldn't fix the unfixable, she walked away, changed her name from Elira Moreau to Elira Voss, left Europe, left the stages, the critics, the applause. She didn't just quit music. She buried it, until Brook Hollow, until a broken piano, a curious boy, and a room full of people who didn't know her past but somehow saw her anyway. Now, she had to decide what came next. She didn't have to decide alone. That evening there was a soft knock at her door. She opened it to find Tavi standing there, holding a small notebook and a thermos. "I brought tea," he said shyly, "and I wrote something." She invited him in. He sat on the edge of her couch, fidgeting with the notebook. "After your performance," he began, "I couldn't stop thinking about it, so I tried to write how it made me feel." He handed her the notebook. Inside, in careful script, was a poem. Not polished, not perfect, but honest. It spoke of silence, of loss, of a single note that made the whole world feel less empty. At the bottom, he'd written, "You didn't just play music. You gave us a place to put our sadness." Elira read it twice. Then she looked at him, really looked, and saw not just a student but someone who understood grief in a way few his age ever had to. "Do you play?" she asked gently. He shook his head. "No, but I want to learn. Not to be famous or anything, just to say things I can't with words." Something in her softened. "Why now?" "Because before I thought music was for people who had everything together," he said. "But you showed me it's for people who don't." She didn't answer right away. Then she stood, walked to the piano, and patted the bench beside her. "Sit," he did, eyes wide. She placed his hands on the keys. "This is C," she said, pressing his finger to a white key. "And this is how you begin." It wasn't a lesson. Not really. It was an offering. A way to say you're not alone. And neither am I, word spread quietly, not through announcements or posters, but through conversations. A student told a friend. A teacher mentioned it to a parent. Within a week, 3 more kids showed up at Elira's door after school, each carrying their own kind of quiet pain, each hoping music might help them carry it. She didn't call it a class. She didn't charge anything. She just opened her door, made tea, and let them sit at the piano. Some wanted to learn scales. Others just wanted to listen. One girl brought her guitar and asked if they could try playing together. Elira said yes. At school, Mr. Halverson approached her during lunch. "We'd like to make this official," he said. "An after-school music circle. You'd be the advisor. We'll give you a room, supplies, even a small stipend." She hesitated. "I'm not a teacher." "You don't have to be," he said. "You just have to be you." She thought about it. Then she nodded. "Only if it's not about performance. Not about competition, just about listening." "Deal," he said, smiling. The first meeting of the Brook Hollow Music Circle was held in the old band room, now cleaned and rearranged with mismatched chairs and a repaired upright piano. 7 students showed up. No audience. No pressure. Just a space where sound could be messy, imperfect, and true. Elira didn't lead so much as guide. She asked questions. "What does this chord make you feel? What story is your melody telling?" She played short pieces, not to impress but to show how music could hold joy, anger, confusion, peace. And slowly the students began to open up. A boy played a clumsy tune he'd written for his dog who'd passed away. A girl sang a lullaby her grandmother used to hum. Tavi, now more confident, played a simple duet with Alira, his first time ever touching piano keys in public. No one clapped. They just nodded, said, "I hear you." Meanwhile, the town continued to change in small ways. The bakery started playing classical music in the mornings. The library added a music corner with donated instruments. Even the mayor mentioned in a town meeting how sometimes the quietest voices have the most to say, but not everyone was comfortable with the shift. One afternoon, a woman Alira didn't recognize approached her after school. She introduced herself as a former student of Alira's, back when she performed as Alira Moreau in Vienna. "I recognized you the moment I saw the video," the woman said. "I've followed your career for years. When you disappeared, we all wondered what happened." Alira tensed. "That life is over. But your gift isn't," the woman said gently. "There are people who would pay anything to hear you play again. Agents are already calling. They want to book you." Alira shook her head. "I'm not going back." "Why not?" "You're still brilliant. The world deserves to hear you." "The world heard me," Alira said quietly, "and I heard it back." "That's enough." The woman left, disappointed but respectful. But the encounter left Alira unsettled. She'd spent so long running from her past that she hadn't considered people might come looking for it. That night she sat at her piano and played for Leora again, not for an audience, but for herself. And this time she didn't feel guilt. She felt gratitude. Gratitude for the music, for her sister, for the chance to share it again, not on a grand stage, but in a small room with kids who needed it as much as she once did. A few days later, the school held a small ceremony to honor her. They didn't give her a trophy or a plaque. Instead, the custodian crew, led by Mr. Darnell, unveiled a newly restored nameplate on the grand piano in the auditorium, the Voss Steinway. Below it, in smaller letters, "For music that heals." Alira touched the wood, tears in her eyes. "You didn't have to do this," Mr. Darnell just nodded. "Some things need saying even without words." As spring turned to early summer, the music circle grew. More students joined. Parents dropped off old instruments. A local musician offered to volunteer. Alira still worked in the front office during the day, still wore her simple clothes, still spoke softly. But there was a new lightness in her step, a quiet joy in her eyes. She hadn't fixed the past. She hadn't erased the pain. But she'd learned something vital, that music wasn't just about mastery or memory. It was about connection, and sometimes the most powerful thing you could do wasn't to perform perfectly, but to show up honestly and say, "This is me. This is what I carry. Will you listen?" And in Brook Hollow, they were finally learning how to listen. Summer arrived in Brook Hollow like a slow exhale, warm, golden, and full of quiet promise. The school year had ended, but the music hadn't. What began as a hesitant gathering in a dusty band room had grown into something no one expected. A community. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, the old auditorium echoed with the sounds of imperfect scales, tentative melodies, and laughter that rose like birdsong above the piano keys. Alira still opened her apartment some evenings too, especially when rain fell or when someone needed to play something they weren't ready to share in front of others. She never called herself a teacher. She didn't wear that title comfortably, but the students called her Miss Voss with a kind of reverence that had nothing to do with authority and everything to do with trust. They came not because they wanted to be stars, but because they wanted to be heard. And in that small town, where life often moved in predictable rhythms, music became a place where feelings could breathe. Tavi was now a regular at both the school sessions and Alira's apartment. He'd traded his notebook of poems for a beginner's violin, second-hand, slightly scratched but tuned with care. He still wasn't great, but he played with a sincerity that made even simple notes feel meaningful. One evening, as fireflies blinked outside Alira's window, he played a short piece he'd written for his mother's birthday, the first one since she'd passed. His hands shook. He missed a note, but he kept going. When he finished, Alira didn't offer corrections. She just said she would have loved that. He nodded, eyes glistening, and that was enough. The town, too, had changed in subtle but lasting ways. The bakery now hosted listening evenings once a month. No performances, just people bringing instruments or recordings and sharing music over tea and scones. The library started a sound journal where anyone could write about a song that moved them. Even the high school principal, once focused only on test scores and attendance, began opening staff meetings with a minute of quiet music saying, "We forget how much we carry. Sometimes we need a moment to set it down." But the biggest change was in Elira herself. She still wore simple clothes. She still spoke softly. But the weight she'd carried for so long, the guilt, the silence, the belief that joy was something she didn't deserve after losing Leora, had begun to lift. Not all at once, not completely, but enough. One afternoon, while sorting through old sheet music, she found a letter she'd written years ago but never sent. It was addressed to Leora, filled with apologies, regrets, and a single line that now struck her differently. "I stopped playing because it felt like loving you all over again, and I couldn't bear the pain." She read it, then folded it carefully and placed it inside the cover of her piano bench. She didn't burn it. She didn't throw it away. She just let it be there, a reminder that grief and love could live in the same space. That same week, Mr. Halvorsen approached her with an idea. "The fall showcase is coming up," he said. "We'd like you to perform again, but this time, not as a replacement, as yourself." She hesitated. "I don't want it to be a spectacle." "It won't be," he promised. "Just you. Your music, no expectations." She thought about it for days. Then she said yes, but with one condition. "I'll play," she told him, "but only if the students play too. Not as an opening act, as equals." He agreed without hesitation. Preparations began quietly. No posters with dramatic headlines, no social media hype. Just word of mouth and a simple note on the school bulletin board. Music night. Original pieces, shared hearts. As the date neared, Elira didn't rehearse alone. She practiced with the students. She helped Tavi refine his violin phrasing. She showed a shy sophomore how to shape a melody like a story. She listened, really listened, as each of them shared what their music meant. One girl played a piece about her parents' divorce. A boy composed a rhythm that mimicked his grandfather's heartbeat during chemo. Another wrote a song for the stray cat she'd adopted. None of it was polished. All of it was true. The night of the showcase arrived warm and clear. The auditorium, filled not just with parents and teachers, but with neighbors, shop owners, even a few folks from the next town over. There were no programs listing names or pieces, just a sign by the door that read, "Come as you are, listen with your heart." The evening began with Tavi, standing alone on stage with his violin. He took a deep breath, nodded to Elira in the wings, and began to play. It wasn't perfect, but it was full of feeling. When he finished, the room didn't erupt in applause. It held its breath, then offered soft, steady clapping, the kind that says, "Thank you for sharing that with us." One by one, the students performed. Some played piano. Others sang, strummed guitars, tapped rhythms on buckets. A few just read poems while Elira played gentle chords beneath their words. No one compared. No one judged. They just witnessed. Then it was Elira's turn. She walked on stage in a simple dress the color of twilight. She didn't bow. She didn't smile for the crowd. She sat at the Voss Steinway, placed her hands on the keys, and closed her eyes. This time she didn't play for Leora. She played something new, unfinished, raw, but alive. It began with a single note, repeated like a question. Then it grew, weaving in fragments of the students' melodies, echoes of their stories. It wasn't a solo. It was a conversation, a tapestry of voices, with hers as just one thread. Halfway through, Tavi stepped back on stage, violin in hand, and joined her, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. Then another student added a soft hum, another tapped a gentle rhythm on the piano bench. Soon, the whole room felt like it was breathing together. When the last note faded, silence returned, not empty, but full. Then, slowly, People began to stand, not out of obligation, but out of gratitude, not for a performance, but for a moment of shared humanity. Afterward, no one rushed to leave. They lingered in the aisles, talking quietly, hugging, wiping tears. A woman approached Elira and said, "My daughter played tonight. She hasn't spoken about her brother's death in 2 years, but she played for him. Thank you for giving her that voice." Elira just nodded. She found it herself. I just held the door open. In the weeks that followed, life in Brook Hollow settled into a new rhythm. The music circle became a permanent part of the school, funded by small donations and run by students and volunteers. Elira still worked in the front office 3 days a week, but the other 2 were reserved for music. Teaching, listening, sometimes just sitting with someone who needed to cry while chords filled the silence. She never returned to the concert stage, never signed with an agent, never sought fame. But she didn't hide anymore either. Her music wasn't a secret. It was a gift, and she gave it freely, without fanfare, to anyone who needed it. One evening, as she walked home past the bakery, now playing Debussy softly through its open windows, she paused and looked up at the stars. She thought of Leora, not with the sharp ache of before, but with a quiet warmth, like remembering a favorite song. "I'm still playing," she whispered. "And I think you'd be proud." Back in her apartment, she sat at her piano, not to practice, not to prepare, just to play. The notes floated out into the night, simple and strong, carrying no grand message, just the truth of a woman who had lost, hidden, and finally come home to herself. And somewhere in Brook Hollow, a child heard those notes and smiled, feeling a little less alone. That more than anything was the real performance, the one that never ended, the one that kept healing note by note, heart by heart.